Hi, this is Tom Needham, and you're listening to The Sounds of Film. And boy, am I excited. I've wanted to speak to our next guest for a long, long time. I'm talking about author Robert Greene. He's the author of Laws of Human Nature. You probably know so many of his other books, including The 48 Laws of Power, The Art of Seduction, The 33 Strategies of War, The 50th Law, and Mastery. I've read them all many times. And I'm sure a lot of you have too. If you haven't, I highly recommend that you check out all of these books. We're going to be talking mostly today about The Laws of Human Nature, his latest book. But I've talked to so many different people in the film industry and in politics through the years. But this is the one I've been really looking forward to the most because if you're familiar with his work, he really just has explained things that are of major importance that have influenced a lot of different people. And like I said before, I'm just so excited to have the opportunity to speak to Robert Greene. Robert, thank you so much for joining us today on The Sounds of Film.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Tom. I'm really honored.
Yeah. So, Robert, I don't even know where to begin. I don't want to go through your whole history because I do want to get into some of the ideas in the book. But one thing I've heard you mention several times before, and I do want to just say up front, if I mischaracterize, I've watched so many interviews that you've done and I've read your books. So if I mix up something that you've said versus something that's written, feel free to correct me anytime, okay?
Sure, sure.
But I've heard you say in some form or another through the years that you had many different jobs before you
Yes,
became, a successful writer. And I believe that one of the jobs was something in Hollywood, that you had wanted to go to Hollywood and make it in that industry. And I was just curious because
yes.
this is The Sounds of Film. If you can just explain a little bit about what it is that you originally intended to do. And I also think that you've kind of hinted at through the years that it was not a very positive experience. It kind of led to some of your later work. I think you've even referred to it as kind of soul sucking or something along those lines. But tell us, like, what was the original intent and what did you find to be true?
Well, I was at the time I was living in Spain. I was teaching English there, and my father wasn't well. He had a form of cancer. So I decided I was going to move back to Los Angeles, and I've been thinking about it anyways. It's like the late 80s. And I thought the natural thing, because my whole heart was into writing, was to come back to Los Angeles and somehow try and make it as a screenwriter, which is about what every other person in Los Angeles is trying to become. And so I was fortunate. I got a job through family connection with a film director whose name I won't mention. He and his wife were a team. She wrote, he directed. He also wrote screenplays. And I worked for him. I was sort of like his assistant, and then I worked as his assistant on various sets. And I helped him with the screenplays and did some writing as well. And, I then tried to write my own screenplays. And I found that it wasn't a good fit. It's not that I hated Hollywood. I love movies. I'm particularly a huge fan of classic movies and a lot of European cinema. So I have a great love for film. But I found that I didn't have the right spirit. Maybe I was too literary, too steep in theater and drama and things from another era. And sort of the silliness in Hollywood, the kind of the unliterary quality of it, where people don't really understand sort of some of the basics of story and drama, although they take all these classes and they read their Lajos Egri and all that stuff. I just realized, this isn't a good fit for me. It's not what I was meant to write. In fact, one time I had written a screenplay, and I had an agent. He kind of liked my work, and he sent it around. And I met with this big producer, and he said, Robert, you should really write for theater. And he meant it as a total diss. Like, theater is that little realm where people go who can't make it in the real world.
Oh, wow.
There's no money, etc. That was kind of a lightning bulb went off in my head. And then the other thing was, I was sort of struck by kind of the hypocrisy I saw in Hollywood. This is the negative side of my experience, where everyone is so PC, is smiling.
Yeah.
Your film is terrific. I loved your screenplay. You look great. But behind the scenes, there was just so much power playing going on that it struck me that really what people were after was power, not so much creativity and not so much money. They wanted to flex their muscles in the industry. They wanted to be seen as important. And yet they had all these ways of kind of disguising it. And so in my some 7 years working in Hollywood, I noticed a lot of the laws of power that ended up being in the book, either used on me or used on other people. And it kind of irritated me that in this world where people talk about everything, they talk about sex and every kind of secret that people have, nobody talks about power and the fact that so many people are obsessed with power. So in many ways, my Hollywood experience, although all my experiences in the work world went into my books, but that was kind of the primary inspiration for the little bit of anger and venom that you'll find in that book.
Not to like repeat a lot of typical like conservative criticism of Hollywood, but did you find it interesting at all how, because you know people there, that like you said before, where everything is very PC in Hollywood, isn't it sort of ironic that like the whole Me Too movement thing has gone down like it has in Hollywood, where supposedly these are supposed to be the people that are the real champions of women's rights, and even like what you were talking about with the pursuit of power, the championing of like liberal politicians, while at the same time, like you're saying, you witnessed firsthand people, I mean, a lot of very wealthy, powerful people, or people trying to get that. Doesn't it seem like a contradiction of sorts, or is it just that's the way it is?
Or is it all what? I'm sorry, was the last thing you said?
Or is that just the nature of like what it is in Hollywood, or really any business? I don't know.
No, I think Hollywood is particularly that way because there is a lot of pressure to be seen as liberal and liberal-minded, and to be on the forefront of all the most progressive issues. You know, I write in my new book about how humans, in my new book about human nature, how we are generally conformists, and I don't mean it necessarily as a criticism of everybody because I include myself in that. It's part of our nature. You put us in a group, you put us in a culture, and that culture changes you, and you feel pressures to fit in. And so I could feel that pressure even myself when I was in Hollywood. And so, you know, you're on the one hand, it's a dog-eat-dog environment. It's one of the most competitive environments you'll ever find. You know, once you're past the age of 48, forget it, you're lost. You know, you have to have all the right connections. It's really a grind. And there's a lot of hostility, there's a lot of resentment, there's a lot of envy. And yet you have to wear a mask. You can't show any of that. You have to disguise your hostility. You have to disguise all your resentment, all your insecurities. And so this goes back to the 20s and 30s and 40s when you're reading things about the industry. And I wrote in The Laws of Human Nature how many times people have come in trying to make a movie thinking, I'm going to change this culture. I'm going to do something that no one else has ever done before. And yet in the end, the culture changes them because it's very powerful. And it's really all about money and power. You know, if your last project didn't make a profit, you know, you're in real trouble. So you're feeling continual pressure in the present to have a hit, to please people, to get meetings, one meeting after another. It's, you know, I wrote in in my first book how probably the purest political environment ever in the history of mankind was the Politburo in the Soviet Union, because there were no metrics for deciding who was successful or not. You know, it didn't depend on if the economy was performing or if, you know, you won elections, because there were no elections. What your success depended on was your political skills. So it was like a pure political power environment. Well, in Hollywood, many of the things are kind of like that, although there are metrics, such as how your film does. But a lot of it is how well you schmooze, you know, the front you present,
right,
and how well you play the game. But at the same time, this is just pure 48 laws of power. You have to disguise that. You can't show people that really what's motivating you is you're playing the game. And you look at the real power players and the agencies, back in the day, like Michael Ovitz.
Right.
I wrote in my latest book about the struggles between Eisner and Ovitz and Jeffrey Katzenberg. This was, it was all about power. And yet they had to make it out as if, well, we're really about making great films, etc. So that was the kind of thing that really irritated me about that world. Because you don't really, in business, it's pretty upfront that people are motivated by these things. In politics, we all know politicians want power. The music industry, maybe it's a little more, but the music industry is known for being cutthroat. Everybody knows that. It's the whole film business that sort of manages to create with Oscars and all the PC crap to create this image that it's not like that. And boy, did that irritate me.
Wow, that's very interesting. I was thinking back, and it's funny. The movies and the TV shows that I've always liked have been sort of the ones that are maybe a little bit different than the typical mainstream films. Even stuff like Goodfellas and TV shows like Curb Your Enthusiasm, and I never really understood why, but I think I came to realize that the reason I like those in particular is that their characters are not perfect, idealized, romantic, heroic characters. That they have flaws, and they have real traits that are not always flattering. But we've come to realize that, and I guess Hollywood is very reluctant to write characters like that very often because they don't fit that mode of what they're trying to sell in Hollywood. But it's funny, so those things have always stood out to me. And then when I came across your books, I think it was a similar thing, like Goodfellas or Curb Your Enthusiasm. Your books have always sounded true to me, sounded like you're onto something, like this is the way people really are. And the human nature aspect of it is something that you obviously tapped into. And what is it exactly that you write about that's not always accurately portrayed in the typical Hollywood characters, would you say?
Well, I don't know if this is to answer your question, but one thing that's always struck me is in film and in drama, going back to Shakespeare, going back to ancient Greeks, we're always fascinated by the villain.
Yeah.
If there were no villains, there would be no drama. What really drives Othello is the character of Iago. We could go on and on down the line.
Yeah.
And we're fascinated by it. What is our fascination? It's at the end of these plays or at the end of these movies, the villain usually is destroyed, is killed, etc. So we're able to feel like, oh, it's about justice.
Right.
But actually, I think it's something else. I think there's a shadow part of the human being that we've had to repress. We've all had to be so polite and nice and wear this mask that we're all, socially progressive, etc. But there's a shadow. I'm talking about the Jungian shadow, which I discuss in my new book, that is a repressed part of our nature. And in my books, I try and say, let's not repress this. Let's not condemn it. Let's confront it as adults that this is who we are. So a lot of what goes into characters in movies is secretly people are excited by the criminals. They're excited by the guy in House of Cards who's manipulating and wheeling his way to the top. There's a secret kind of repressed identification with these characters, and yet nobody will admit it because at the end it's always the same thing. Justice prevails, truth prevails, which is never really how it is in the real world.
Right.
And so I think that deep down, we're all kind of fascinated by people who are more kind of open and authentic about their Machiavellian, Iago-like nature. And that's sort of what I've always been writing about. My first book, The 48 Laws of Power, is really about the Machiavellian personality and the manipulator. And, I have some literary license in that I kind of, sort of almost as if I'm celebrating some of the manipulations involved, although I don't really feel that way personally. But this book has sold well over 2 million copies. It really struck a chord. even people who hate it and who hate me are fascinated by the book. And I'm not, tooting my own horn. I just think that we are fascinated by this secret realm. It's like a taboo subject, and anything that's taboo is what people are actually secretly drawn to. So these kind of manipulator Machiavellian characters, these ones, or like a Larry David in Curb Your Enthusiasm, who's sort of more upfront about his incredible neuroses.
Right.
It's like, wow, it's like refreshing to see something that's like that, as opposed to all the PC stuff that our culture just sort of inundates us with.
You mentioned Carl Jung. I was just about to ask you about him. I've heard you say that you think that we're in the midst of a very special moment in human history. That millennials are looking for meaning. They're looking for something different, and I guess that's always the case. But right now, like as an example, I don't know whether you like him or dislike him, but I mean, Jordan Peterson is all over the place. He's selling out like theaters. It's really just like a phenomenon. And one of the things that kind of struck me is that I think you were kind of like ahead of the curve, is that he talks a great deal about crime and punishment and Carl Jung, and he kind of just takes little bits and pieces and kind of like makes it his own. But he's selling it to a young generation, and you've been talking about those works yourself for some time, and even right now in the laws of human nature. What is it about Jung, crime and punishment, that's resonating now with young audiences and even older audiences?
Well, I'm not exactly sure about what Jordan Peterson's take is on crime and punishment. I know I can speak for myself about my absolute adoration of Fyodor Dostoevsky as a writer. Crime and Punishment might be one of my favorites, along with The Possessed.
Yeah.
But they're all great. Is that he is one of the people, like I just talked about. He wants humanity to embrace its darker side and come to terms with it. And he's obviously speaking from a Christian point of view. And one of the most illuminating great experience that changed Dostoevsky was, as a young man, he was a bit of a socialist, and he got arrested for perhaps conspiring against the Tsar. He was put in prison, and then he went through a mock execution in which they literally thought he was about to be executed. And then the last second he was reprieved, and they shipped him off to Siberia. And in Siberia, he had to live in a penal colony with the worst riffraff in all of Russia, the most hardened criminals. And he found it the greatest experience of his life. He saw these are real people. These are people that aren't pretending. They're trapped in their human nature. Their only redemption to him would be through Christianity. But at least they understood the sinfulness in human nature. They understood the dark side of it, and they were expressing it. And he had tremendous sympathy for criminals, for prostitutes, for people who were marginalized in society, because he saw something more real in them, something more human. And he was rebelling against a lot of the scientific of the spirit of the time and all the emphasis on rationality. And he wanted to say that no, humans are basically irrational. They're perverse. They'll go after something that's not in their self-interest just so that they feel like they have freedom. And so that kind of overall larger picture of humanity, seeing us in our full light, is something that deeply, deeply appeals to me. It's deep what I like about all the writers in my little pantheon, like Nietzsche. And there are not many of them. There are not many of them who have the boldness to say, this is what the human being is really like. So to me, that's my appreciation of Dostoevsky. And the character Raskolnikov, I don't know how Jordan Peterson is exactly approaching it, but the idea that, he is somebody who in the end seeks redemption. He has to go through a tremendous process of learning about himself and learning about how, he turned into a murderer and why, and not blaming it on his poverty, etc., but coming to terms with his own responsibility as a human being and then being redeemed by that. How many books anymore even go near that kind of taboo idea, as if we are responsible for our criminal or sinful or dark activities, as if they need to be redeemed. It's so old-fashioned that I think it has a lot of appeal to people who are inundated with a culture that basically tries to create the idea that there is no meaning in life, that everything is just the same, that, so I can't really speak exactly for the appeal to millennials, but that to me is the appeal to me at least.
Well, there's a lot there. I'm not really exactly clear, I'm sorry, what your position is in terms of human nature, in terms of, let's kind of tackle it in a couple different ways.
Sure.
One of the big debates, obviously, for a long time has been the nature versus nurture debate. And,
yes.
and I've seen you write and talk about how there's definitely aspects that you seem to think has to do with genetics. You write about the bad babies, the bad seeds, the studies that have been done that show that some babies are just born bad. But you also talk a great deal about how you think that the early years in a person's life are incredibly influenced by their parents. Now, most people seem to take like one or the other position.
Right.
What exactly is your position? And then I want to kind of go from there to get into some of the stuff that you were just talking about in terms of meaning of life.
Well, I don't have a bone to pick. I'm not trying to support the geneticists and the neuroscientists who emphasize DNA, or the other people who try and emphasize social conditions and education. I just want the truth and the reality.
Yeah.
And to me, the reality is clearly that both are very important components. To disregard the genetic component, how our brains are wired differently, and all the studies that have shown that there are certain brains that have a propensity towards criminal behavior or narcissism, or to disregard the work of Melanie Klein, who studied infants for 30, 40 years and quite clearly came to the conclusion that there is such a thing as a bad seed, that some children, in her terminology, were born greedier than others and had a propensity towards envy. I buy all of that. I think that's definitely shown. But then it's clear as well that, I can't tell you the percentage. I can't say 40% of the influence is this and 60% the other. I don't really know that. I'm not a scientist. But clearly the early years, when we are extremely vulnerable, we haven't learned language yet, we're so deeply dependent on our mother and our parents, and we're like sponges soaking up their energy in ways that we're not even conscious of, that clearly a lot of what forms us are those very, very early years. And then moving forward, there'll be experiences that we have in school and what other people tell us who we are and our opinions of teachers and peers. So nurture and nature have both a very powerful role to play in who we are.
If it's true that we're born with this basic human nature that includes a lot of traits that I think society characterizes as negative, like bad traits, which you're saying it's just part of the human experience, and maybe we should just embrace it or understand it. Where does morality come into play then? Like you talked about like redemption before. Is there anything to redeem? I mean, if someone like, Sam Harris talks about this a lot, that, I mean, he's not a believer in religion or anything like that. But he talks about the fact that, like, if, I think if he heard you say that someone is born a bad seed, then are they even responsible for their actions?
Yes, they are responsible. And there are many cases of people, I don't know if you're familiar with Sam Vakman.
No.
He's a man who diagnosed himself as having an extreme narcissistic disorder to the point of almost being criminal-like. And now he writes about it, he blogs about it, he does all kinds of podcasts.
Oh,
And he's
okay.
trying to illuminate to other people the dangers of the narcissistic personality and enlighten us. So the redemption comes from self-awareness. And I have other stories of people who were criminal-minded and who understood where this came from and what their tendencies were. And by becoming aware of the dangers and the many, many stories of prisoners who have been rehabilitated, of course there's redemption for anybody, but it won't come without awareness, And so my whole point is all of us have these traits. So earlier you asked me a very good question about nurture or nature, but let's give an example like envy. Envy is something that I say in my book is deeply rooted in human nature. It comes from our primate quality and the fact that we're always comparing ourselves as a social animal to what other people have. Envy was a terrible problem among hunter-gatherer societies and our most primitive ancestors. So it obviously has deep roots in human nature, and anybody who will argue against that, I think, is a fool. On the other hand, certain people have a definitely more pronounced tendency towards envy than others, and I mentioned Melanie Klein's assessment of that. But the fact is, all of us have this tendency. So what I wanted to remove from us is this judgment element of, oh, he's a narcissist, she's full of envy, he's aggressive. And I wanted to point out that these are qualities that are innate to all of us, that they're part of how we are wired, how our brains function as social animals. And so for the person who suffers from severe envy, it's going to be very difficult for them to ever get out of that, because the nature is that if you try and call them on it, it only triggers their insecurities, it only makes them more defensive. It's very difficult. It's also very difficult for all of us. But if we become aware of the fact that we have this tendency to compare ourselves to others, and that it creates all kinds of behavior that is not positive and it actually causes us problems, we can begin to correct it. So, I've had moments in my own life, and I talk about this, it's kind of an emotional intelligence thing. But if I'm aware of why I'm angry, of what triggers anger, of what makes me aggressive, are there certain things that make me insecure, or why I'm prone to, at certain moments, to write an angry email or yell at someone, when I'm aware of those tendencies in myself, I can begin to control them. And it's not a question of repressing these elements. I'm not in favor of repressing your aggressiveness or your envy or whatever. I'm in favor of channeling, of being aware and channeling the parts of your nature that you can't control, but that you can channel in productive purposes. So that's my definition of morality or redemption, is self-awareness. And I believe the problem that we face in our culture is very few people are self-aware. We live in a culture of everybody judging everyone else.
Mm.
As I said, it's always the other person who's the narcissist, who's grandiose, who has a dark side. And very few people, you'll notice in politics or in entertainment or in the news, will ever simply say, yes, that's me, that's who I was, I made a mistake, it's part of my character, I take responsibility for it. Instead, it's always, oh, I was pushed into it, or that wasn't me,
Right.
something came over me. So we have a culture that points, everything has to be externalized, and very few people look inward. So that's where I try and alter the perspective on us, on our human nature.
We're speaking with Robert Greene. You're listening to The Sounds of Film, and we're talking about his latest book, The Laws of Human Nature. You talk about envy. I've heard you talk about the studying of body language in relationship to envy, and that's some really interesting stuff. Can you talk a little bit more about envy? Because the first time I heard you write about envy was in the 48 Laws of Power.
That's right.
And I was so blown away, when you were just be careful, be leery of your friends, because friends are the ones who are most likely to be envious. That was mind blowing. And then from there, you've written so much more, and particularly in this book, you dig deep into it. What have you learned about body language and envy?
Well, it's a controversial field, and you're diving into something that the science on it, there's disagreements. But from what my belief is that in the word envy in Latin is related to the word invidia, and the root has to do with the evil eye. And so the focus in nonverbal communication on envy is the eyes. And often what you're looking for in nonverbal communication is a disjunction between parts of the face and the expression, so that the person smiles, but the eyes are cold and empty and looking through you, or the person frowns, but the eyes are all excited and lit up. The latter usually means that something is, or a desire has been repressed and they're trying to hide it. The first one means that they're experiencing a kind of a negative emotion that they're trying to disguise from you. And so the idea is that the eyes are generally the source of envy. You'll notice that people are their eyes are kind of eating you up, and the eyes display a kind of a resentment. So if you tell somebody some good news about yourself, like, wow, I just sold my screenplay, they're very envious. You notice that there'll be that kind of tight smile on their face.
Oh, wow.
But the eyes the pupils won't be dilated, they'll be kind of pinpointed, and they'll have that kind of slightly daggery look that they can't help, that they try and disguise, but it comes through quite clearly. That's kind of one of the main elements in the envy sort of nonverbal behavior syndrome. I talk in the book about tests you can have, and this, people might see this is a little bit cruel, but I got the idea from the philosopher Schopenhauer. He said, if you want to test people if they're envious, tell them some good news about yourself, or tell them some bad news about yourself. And the good news, you'll notice a very immediate kind of frown, or that look in the eye that I was talking about,
a
sense of disappointment that they immediately try to cover up with, oh, that's wonderful, I'm so happy for you. And if you tell them some bad news about yourself, like you just got fired, they'll say, oh, I'm so sorry. But you'll notice that there's that kind of excited look in the eye that I was mentioning earlier.
Oh, man.
So those are sort of the nonverbals that go with envy,
Now, does everyone feel that to some extent?
Yes, I do. I think it's true, and I've analyzed it in myself. So I've had people that are, you were saying that beware of friends. One of the most ancient writers is the ancient Greek Hesiod, and he wrote in like the 6th, 7th century BC, potter envies potter, writer envies writer. I forget what the words were, but basically people in the same profession envy each other. So if you're a writer, you're not going to really envy an emperor who has power. You're going to envy another writer who got a much better advance than you. And so I've noticed it in myself when I see that, wow, here's a writer who I don't think necessarily deserves success, but they're getting a huge advance, or their book is selling well. And it's an ugly emotion, and I don't like it in myself. But I have to admit that it happened, that for a few seconds, or maybe even a few minutes, I experienced envy. And the reaction that I have and that other people have is to disguise it by saying, oh, they didn't really deserve their success. They're really not such a good writer. We don't want to admit that envy is the source of it. So I'm very big into self-analysis, and I, very much see that I'm prone to this, and I believe everybody is.
Yeah. Why is it ugly, though? What does it matter?
Well, you're right. I mean,
I'm not saying it doesn't matter. I'm just saying
we need to accept human nature. It's just that, I try and say that there's a kind of a more noble aspect towards life. Noble in the sense of how Nietzsche would describe it, and that's where we don't give into the petty part of our personality, and that's kind of petty. Like, what difference does it make if somebody else is making more money or has more success? Shouldn't my attention be on myself and what I'm doing? Isn't there a way for me to be more excited about competing with that person and emulating them and trying to to do just as well as they do rather than feel kind of negative towards them? Isn't it a good, noble quality to admire people who are successful and wish them well? We all know that when we work with other people, when we feel good for their success, we feel better about ourselves. And when we feel like petty and banal and backbiting and bitter, it's an ugly feeling. It's not comfortable, and we do want to have this self-image of ourselves as being someone who's pro-social and who cooperates and thinks and wants to work with other people. So that's what I mean by being kind of ugly and finding a way. So in that envy chapter, as I do in all my chapters in the book, I end by showing you how you can take this natural tendency to compare yourself to others and turn it into some positive thing, not repress it, which is impossible. Every minute of every day, if you looked at yourself honestly, you would have to realize how many times you are constantly comparing yourself to what other people have and what they're doing. You can't control it. But let's try and turn it into something that's productive and pro-social, and I give several ideas on that in the book.
You give a lot of good ideas in this book. I hope you don't mind me bringing this up, but I have noticed that you've talked about this in other interviews. You just recently had a near-death experience, and
right.
And I was wondering if you don't mind talking about it. If you don't, I'm fine just moving on. But from having that experience, maybe you could share it with the audience if you're willing, how that has affected the way you now look at your work and the way that people are receiving your work.
Well, I don't know how I'm not sure exactly the last part of your question. I can tell you that about 8.5 months ago, I suffered a stroke. Excuse me. And, it was a pretty bad stroke. And if my wife hadn't been in the car while I was driving and gotten the ambulance there right away, I either would have suffered severe brain damage, which I wouldn't be talking to you right now, or I would have gone in a terrible accident, or I literally would have died. And we've seen in the news several people lately, the film director John Singleton and then the actor Luke Perry, who had strokes, and there was nobody around, and they died, and that could have very easily been my story.
Wow.
So, it's not like I experienced that way. I was unconscious for a while, and I do have some strange, vivid memories of that. But it's not like people who really stopped breathing and then came back to life. I can't say it's dramatic as that. But it was a very close brush with death. And it was very ironic in a way. It's like the gods are playing dice with me. Because just 3 months earlier, I finished my chapter on mortality, how we need to confront it and how we need to make it something real and present and visceral, and it's not just this kind of lukewarm idea that we discuss. And here it happened to me. So it was almost like, some kind of weird twist of fate. That's how I experienced it. It was also a series of remarkable coincidences that led to the stroke, that if one of them hadn't happened, I wouldn't have had the stroke. So it made me look at the tenuousness of life and how just the slightest alteration in chance, that car that pulls out seconds before you crossed its path that could have killed you, on and on and on. It makes you aware of how any moment, you literally are facing death at any moment. So it kind of brought home to an idea to me that I write about, but that was always sort of intellectual and now became very real. And the main thing is I've learned a lot about myself. I've learned good things about myself, about how a lot of inner resources I had to draw upon, my humor to deal with the situation. And then I also learned some bad things about myself, my lack of patience. It takes me like 20 minutes in the morning to tie my shoes because I lost control of the left side of my body. And I've had to develop patience that I've never had before because I'm kind of a type A personality. So it's brought out the strengths and the weaknesses in me. And that's about really all I can say. I mean, as far as how people view my work. I don't quite know what you meant by that.
Well, the only reason I asked that is, and I'm not sure exactly what I was implying, but if you had any kind of change of sense of purpose in your own life, one of the things I think that's unique about your work is that some people will take your books like 48 Laws of Power and will read it just as an informative kind of thing to learn about human nature or to defend themselves against powerful people. But then there's also the realization, I guess, that people might have that some people could take your book and use it to obtain power that could end up hurting other people.
Yeah.
It's kind of like a gun. Some people are pro-gun, some are anti-gun, but the people that are anti-gun say, well, it's only a bad person who uses the gun that does something bad. But you have a lot of work out there that kind of is like an instructional manual in terms of human behavior that could be used for good and evil if one even believes in good and evil. So I wasn't sure. I probably didn't phrase the question very well. Whether your experience has made you any more concerned or not about how people might take your books and use them. And I don't think I really phrased the question that well. But I guess what I was asking was if this near-death experience that you had, sometimes those kinds of experiences change people spiritually, religiously. I'm not sure what you went through, but your books are sort of unique in that, like the 48 Laws of Power. A lot of people could say that you could read that book and take it and do some harm in the world, or you could take it and do some good. I'm not making any judgment. I don't really know, but has it affected you in any way in terms of like how you're concerned that people may or may not use your books?
Well, this is where I'm not quite sure, because obviously, why wouldn't I be concerned about that even before having a stroke? Why would a stroke suddenly make me concerned about people? I've always been concerned about it.
Yeah.
But, I wrote the book. I mean, the one thing that did happen to me and when I had the stroke is it made me very empathetic towards people who are helpless and dependent, because for several months I was completely helpless and dependent.
Oh, wow.
And when I see now people who are disabled and such, I have a different kind of feeling towards them. It's a terrible experience to go through, and I have much more empathy. So it changed me on that level. But as far as my books, I don't believe in kind of regret or things like, oh, I wish I hadn't done that, because I think that's kind of a false emotion. I stand by the book. I don't, I know that I occasionally get emails from people who say that somebody used this book in a bad way, and I believe them, and I write back and I try and give them counsel. But I receive 95, 98% of emails from people saying how much it helped them deal with very difficult power situations. Now, I'm not saying that that's legitimate science, because probably people who've had good experience are more likely to write to me, so there's a bit of a bias there. But I've definitely get a lot of emails from people, and the reason I think that that's valid is I myself was kind of a naive person in working in Hollywood and elsewhere. I'm not a Machiavellian type by nature, although I have tendencies like anybody does. I'm not a master manipulator. I was more on the innocent, naive side, and I had some bad experiences. And I find a lot of the readers of the book are similar to me in that sense.
Yeah.
And then I have a huge readership in the African American community, among hip hop artists, etc., black entrepreneurs, blacks who were trying to get in the music industry, and they related to the book because this is how the power game is, and all the other advice that they were getting was sort of this toasty things you get in business school about management techniques, etc. But that isn't the reality. And African Americans have dealt with the ugly, the harshest side of power games in the United States. So the book rang true with them. My description of what really goes on seemed honest. So, I do occasionally get things where people have said that, like the Art of Seduction, a woman will write that she fell into the hands of an evil seducer, and and she blames me for it, etc. And I feel bad about that for sure. But there are many more examples of other women who've said, I read the book, and it really opened my eyes to what this man was doing to me, and I'll never be so naive again.
Yeah.
So it kind of cuts both ways. But I like to look at the reader as an adult.
Yeah.
I think we tend to infantilize people in our culture, where we try and hold their hand and be a little nanny and say, you shouldn't read this, you need to read that. Here I'm here to tell you what is good, and here I'm going to tell you what's bad. I'm against that trend 100%. You're an adult. You're now taking responsibility for your life. You've reached a certain point where you don't need to be held your hand, and you don't need trigger warnings or safe spaces. Here's how it is in the real world. Now do with that knowledge what you will, kind of thing.
I agree. Going back to some more information in your book, one of the big sections is about narcissism, which you mentioned earlier. And I don't want to Trump bash at all, but I didn't.
Oh, go ahead.
But when he first came into power, like it seemed like every other day there was like articles about narcissism, and he's a narcissist, and what are the signs of, like, it was all over the place for a little while. But you really write about it in an interesting way. What is really dangerous about a narcissist? You don't have to talk about Trump, but just in general, why are narcissists such a problem?
Well, I try and make the point, as I've mentioned before, that we all have narcissistic tendencies. We're all on the spectrum. It's part of our nature to be self-absorbed and to turn inward at an early age and develop a self that we can turn to that protects us. So we all have a degree of self-love and self-obsession. So stop judging and moralizing and imagining that you're not like that, because we all are like that.
Yeah.
But there's some people who I call a deep narcissist. And the real danger with deep narcissists is the origin of what makes them a deep narcissist is that probably something in their early childhood was broken. Bad parenting, in which the child didn't develop a strong sense of self. They didn't have enough self-esteem to retreat to. So when something was bad happened or they were criticized, they couldn't turn around and be alone and go, well, really I'm not such a bad person. I don't have to take that criticism, etc. These people haven't developed that, and so their only avenue for dealing with wounds, for dealing with criticism, is to lash out, or is to try and get attention. They're constantly needing attention to validate their sense of self-worth because they can't get it from within. And so the problem with deep narcissists is that they're charming. Because you take a child who's 5 or 6 years old who never developed that core of, I'm basically a good person, I love myself, and they need then to get love and validation from parents, from teachers, from friends, is they learn to become very charming. They learn to be very pleasing, very dramatic, to kind of flatter people, etc. But what we see is the charm and the kind of social quality. What we're not seeing is the deep wells of insecurity that are inside them, that they have, that there's like a bottomless pit there. They can never get enough attention and recognition. And the great psychoanalyst Heinz Kohut, who's probably the first great analyzer of narcissism in psychology, he said that narcissists have a very particular viewpoint of other people. They see people as what he called self-objects. Other people aren't just people with their own lives. People are objects to be used. They're extensions of yourself. They are there in the world to feed your ego, to do the dirty work for you, to get what you need in life. And so the real problem with narcissists, particularly the narcissistic leader, because they often have charisma, is that they pull you in with their drama, with their very good at getting attention and kind of performing. They draw you in, they make you excited, you follow them, and then you realize that it's all about them and that they're using you and that they have no connection to you as a human being. They have no empathy. I worked for somebody like that recently. I was on the board of directors of a publicly traded company. He was a man who I was friends with, whom I liked very much, and he was very charming, and he knew how to flatter me and give me gifts and praise me as a writer, etc. But it didn't come from a place of actual concern for me or thinking about me. It came from a place of, how can I use this person to further my own agendas?
Yeah.
And so the problem with deep narcissists is you'll get involved with them, you'll let them be your boss, you'll marry them, you'll get in a relationship with them because they're good at this certain element of getting attention and being dramatic and charismatic. And before it's too late and your emotions are engaged, you realize that they really don't give a damn about you, that it's all about themselves. And it's very, very difficult to disengage at that point.
Wow. We don't have too much more time, but are there any other particular, laws of human nature that you feel need more attention brought to people?
Well, there are 18 of them, and they're like 18 children, so I can't really say which is more important. But, I have a chapter in there about the importance of your attitude towards life. And I illustrate that with the story of the great writer Anton Chekhov and how he had an epiphany at an early age. He had probably the worst childhood you can imagine, growing up in poverty, in this really awful, muddy little deserted village in Russia. His father was an alcoholic who beat him almost every single day and then abandoned the family to go run off to Moscow. And he had every reason to hate his parents, his family, the city he was living in, and to turn into a drunk or a deadbeat or someone who committed suicide like his brothers. And instead, one day, he had this kind of epiphany when he was 16 or 17, that he was going to do something very different. He was going to try and forgive all of these people in his life who had been so ugly to them. He was going to try to understand them. He was going to understand why his father was that way instead of judging him. His father had had a very miserable childhood. His father had been beaten every day. So naturally, he had turned into not the best parent in the world. His mother had other weaknesses. Naturally, his siblings were all messed up because of this background. And what if I, instead of hating and judging and getting all bitter and resentful, what if I let go of all those emotions and I love these people and I try and help them and I try and realize that actually everything that's bad in my life is good. So this miserable little town that I'm growing up in called Taganrog is filled with the most bizarre characters. I'm going to turn these characters into short stories, into novels, into plays. All these bad experiences that I've had, they've made me tougher. They've made me appreciate what life is. On and on. By changing how you look at the world, you change everything that happens to you. And so I go in the book and I describe how we see the world through a lens, and that lens is our attitude. And a lot of that attitude comes from what we talked about earlier, how we're genetically wired, whether we're an introvert or an extrovert.
Yeah.
Our early experiences with our parents, etc. And everything we see consequently in our lives is colored by this attitude, by these experiences, by this lens. And you have the power to be aware of it, to be conscious of it, and to change it and to alter it into something that's more positive and expansive. So a negative attitude is very small and constricted, in which you're judging everything, you're bitter about everything, you have the same recurring obsessive thoughts.
So, Robert, so you're talking about that people really do have the ability to recognize their true nature, and,
yes,
and then do something positive with it. I don't know how much you want to get into it, but I have heard you mention in a few interviews Zen Buddhism.
yes.
Is this something that's kind of related to some of the stuff that you're talking about, the beliefs of Buddhism? or not necessarily?
Yes, definitely. In a kind of a grander way, Buddhism is trying to make you aware of the self that you have, that you carry with you, and how that this self is basically false, that it's a construction, that it's a social construction, that you live in language and you live in this kind of mirrored hall where the judgments of other people kind of form who you become and what you think about yourself. And you internalize all these things, and it's false. It's not reality. And so Zen Buddhism is trying to get you back in touch with reality, which is the sense that all forms of life are connected, that it's all one, that all the kind of the dualism in our thinking is just an illusion, and sort of break through all of these things and also become aware, very much aware of the dark side in human nature. So there's definitely that element in it. And I guess because of my own interest in it, I am structuring it in the sense of each chapter is kind of modeled on an idea of enlightenment.
Yeah.
Are you learning about who you are will now enlighten you and give you possibilities to change. And certainly the last chapter on confronting death and mortality and what I call the sublime, the sublime is very much influenced by my own readings in Zen Buddhism.
What can we learn from just accepting that we're going to die and just being more aware of that and recognizing it?
Well, it's not easy, and it can't be sugar-coated. You can't just give people bromides about, just come to terms with it. It's natural, etc. Because we all have a fear of it, and you have to confront that fear. And the problem in our culture is we have a very strongly death-avoidant culture. We don't see, we don't see animals die when we eat our food. We don't see people in hospitals dying. We can go through our whole life without ever really witnessing a death, and so we're very avoidant on that level. And so the main thing is to turn around and confront it, because I think avoiding death and not thinking about it at all creates latent anxiety, and it's why so many people feel this kind of anxiety in life that they can't even begin to describe. It's an unconscious process that I think afflicts us all. So just simply by the fact of turning around and confronting it and meditating on it and thinking, this could be my last act today. This could be the last thing I do, the last thing I say, the last thing I create. And just coming to terms with that, I think actually helps you deal with this anxiety and help you, actually get over this fear that I think can be crippling you, because it can create other layers of fear in your life that you're not even aware of. But beyond that, confronting your mortality has all sorts of other benefits, such as the fact that all living things die, and that's what connects you to everything, and that's what connects you to other people. And so seeing the mortality in the people around you, in your wife, in your children, in your people that you work with, and realizing that 30, 50, 60 years, none of them will be here, is kind of a humbling thought, and it can make you kind of connect to them in an empathetic way. That person that you dislike is actually dealing with their own fears of dying, and they're going to be sitting on a deathbed one day, and maybe that can help sort of soften your negative feelings towards them. I write in the book how during the Great Plague of 1680s or 50s, in London, suddenly everybody was facing death, and it could attack rich or poor alike, Catholic as well as Protestant. And suddenly people felt an intense bond with each other, because death is the great equalizer. And for a moment they let go of all their schisms and all their hatred. And Daniel Defoe, who wrote this book, The Journal of the Plague Year, it was kind of a blissful few months in which which people finally felt connected to one another. So death has that effect. It also has the effect of making you feel more kind of alive and amazed at this mystery of life and what happens in the world, and just makes you in general more energized and sense of urgency, like this could be the end tomorrow. And what was odd, I mean, I'm writing a proposal for my next book, which deals with a lot of these subject matters. And I've been reading books by people who've had near-death experiences. And they all say that it was like the most incredible experience, that afterwards, like days later, all the problems of life had melted away. They were no longer had the same recurring obsessive thoughts in their head. It was like suddenly they had a sense of what really matters and priorities, and they said that their whole scale of values had changed. Well, we can't all have a near-death experience, but we can all kind of go there somewhat in our imagination and reap some of the benefits of that. So that was sort of the point in that chapter.
Well, I can't wait to read that book. We've been speaking with Robert Greene, and his book that we've been discussing for most of the show is Laws of Human Nature, but he's also well known for 48 Laws of Power, The Art of Seduction, The 33 Strategies of War, The 50th Law, and Mastery. I'd recommend all of them, but especially check out Laws of Human Nature. Robert, I could really speak to you for like 10 more hours. I want to thank you so much for coming on the show. And you're welcome back anytime you'd like to talk about your books. Thank you so much. I really appreciated this.
Well, thank you so much, Thomas. You asked very good probing questions. I really appreciate it.
Okay. Well, have a great night, and hopefully we can do this again.
I would love to. Thank you very much.
Okay. Take it easy, Robert.